Anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Today is part 2 of our meeting cluster series. The series is focused on the assessment discussion, which happened yesterday. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about what has gone on with disrupted learning and how we could recover in a way that focuses on equity. My name is Patrick Lyons. I'm a policy specialist focused on T3 policy here at the National Conference of State Legislators. I'll be joined in facilitating this meeting by my colleague, Benjamin Olnick Brown, who is our K-12 research analyst. Before we get into today's agenda, I want to go over a few ground rules for today's meeting. Let's see. Please join by video so we can see all of your faces, and please add your full name to your tile. If you're not sure how to do that, there are 3 little dots in the upper right-hand corner of your box when you hover over your own picture. Be ready to contribute to the conversation. We want this to be collaborative. We want you to ask questions as you have them of our guests here today. Please feel free as they're speaking to throw those questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the appropriate time. Please mute your audio when you are not speaking. We want to just make sure that we limit background noise as much as possible. Do not share your screen under any circumstance. We want to make sure that the only screen that's shared is the one that we here at NCSL are sharing, or maybe some slides that our guests may share. And just so you know, this meeting is being recorded and will be shared at a later time so our constituents can view it at their convenience. Just keep that in mind as we go through this process. All right, so before we get in today's agenda, I want to talk a little bit about the context that this meeting is in. Obviously, one of the reasons we're all here is a concern over the disjointed learning that has happened in the past year and the impact that it's had on students. From everyone from policymakers, educators, parents are just worried about what it means to have had such a disrupted educational experience. So we're going to talk about ways to measure that impact. We're going to talk about the role that assessments can play in that, both formal and less formal assessments. Thinking about ways to think about student learning differently than we have in the past. And lastly, we're going to talk about some of the results that we're seeing in early research on the impact of the pandemic and the best ways to build back. The structure for our conversation today, we're very excited to have 3 education experts here to talk to you all. We're going to speak with each of them in turn about some of the recent research they're working on, some of the way that they view the disjointed learning that's gone on in the pandemic, and how they're thinking about ways to identify what has happened in terms of learning loss, and if learning loss is even a term we should be using, and ways to think about equity in building these recovery plans. We're joined, of course, by Dr. Ioma Uroka from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Ioma is a research professor of public policy and the founding director of the Equity Research Action Coalition at the Frank Porter Graham Children Development Institute. We're also joined by Dr. Jen DePaoli, senior researcher at the Learning Policy Institute, and Dr. Megan McCormick, research associate for the Family Wellbeing and Children's Development at MDRC. With that, I'd like to jump right into our conversation. We're going to start by speaking with Ioma on some of her work. Ioma, first off, thank you for joining us. We're so happy that you could be here today. And thank you so much for taking time out of your family's spring break for this conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you, Patrick. I'm so glad to be here with you and everybody else.
Great. So our first question is, could you just explain a little bit of the survey work that you're doing to gather some of the diverse experiences that families have had during this pandemic?
Sure. So again, I just want to say thank you. And really, as a mother of 2 young children, a 4- and 7-year-old, I live it, but also clearly also doing research around it. So I would say that, the work that I'm doing is both leveraging current studies that I've been a part of and also some new partnerships. So one has been with the Department of Education, a national study, a network really of those who engage in pre-K through grade 3. And so we've been able to gather data really around how families, educators, school leaders imagine the pandemic and how they're really collaborating with families. And this is really mostly from the Nebraska site that I'm a part of. And another one is really with the Educare Learning Network, which is really a public-private partnership that's really undergirded by Head Start and Early Head Start. And that's been a long-going study or partnership. And we've been gathering how are families with young children who are from low-income households, how have they been experiencing the pandemic, but how are schools, particularly early care education programs, working with, collaborating with families around ensuring that children are still obviously healthy and well, but also being provided with as much early learning supports and engagement as needed. And then I would say the latest one in particular is with the University of Oregon and Phil Fisher's team in their rapid assessment of pandemic impact on development in early child, which is called also the Rapid EC. And with that, we really have been sort of really trying to identify or really understand how are families across the country with children from birth to age 5, how are they experiencing the pandemic in terms of economic stability, material hardship, social and health access and impact, as well as just even issues around discrimination and racism. And to me, we've been sort of focusing on how do we make sure that through these different mechanisms, they were trying to capture really the voices of families, particularly families of color and families from low income households and communities, to see how are they really dealing with it and how are early care education programs and schools really helping families to help and support their children in really this critical time period of learning.
Excellent, thank you. So the next obvious question is what are you seeing in your preliminary research about how student learning changed during the pandemic? And I think a tag to that is we see the term learning loss a lot. How do you feel about the term? Is that really accurate?
So, well, I'm glad you asked me that question. So, I mean, as a parent, particularly of a 4 and 7-year-old, for me, that term is in many ways pejorative, right? Because number one, it doesn't even give credit to the families, to the educators who have been working in ways and places and spaces that they've never had to work in. Like, I never thought I would ever have to work, me and my husband have to work with our 4 and 7-year-olds in sort of in terms of virtual learning. That was never something we actually got trained to do. Same thing with the educators, never had to deal with having to teach a number of children through a virtual learning platform. The curricula were not set up for that. The assessment were not set up for that. So in many ways, it's actually pejorative to kind of say there's learning loss. Now, there may be sort of different outcomes, right, based on whether it's NWEA data that's suggesting that children may not be performing at a particular level for particular assessment. But to say learning loss really undermines a lot of what children are learning in the household or even in other formal or informal things that they're in, right? It doesn't talk about how children are having to regulate themselves in front of a camera. Like, how many of us adults can regulate ourselves in front of a camera for 2 to 3 hours a day, right? Like that. So I think in the end of it, we really need to, I think, begin to sort of think much more thoughtfully about our language and the message it sends to families who have been working hard. And it sends a message to teachers and educators who have been working hard, to family advocates who have been working hard to truly support families, especially those who are literally dealing with not just a loss of a job, but a loss of loved ones, risk of getting sick, of being hospitalized. So I think we have to really, really manage how we see children, particular groups of children, and how we articulate it in a way that doesn't sort of say, children, you are not smart, or you are not learning. I think that's a really dangerous ground to go on with that kind of language. So I do hope that we begin to sort of change the narrative about the learning loss and maybe really articulate what is that children need to learn based on standardized assessments, but also figure out what are children doing and learning, right, in ways that we have never fully embraced, right? And especially when you have a lens of equity, it really reminds you that there are many things that children were able to do and we're learning and we're developing that have never been fully captured in a standardized assessment. Again, remember, standardized assessments are short, they're discrete, they don't always capture the full breadth of a child and what they bring to the learning space. So I do think there are things that we can do. But I would say, at least with some of the work that I'm doing with other colleagues, we are finding that yes, the children may not be doing as well in assessments, but I would say the analysis is still ongoing because the issue is that we have not been able to assess all the children, right? In many of the urban settings, we haven't been able to get into schools because the schools are like, oh my goodness, we're still too stressed. So even we have a lot of missing data for us to really say, what are children losing? And are we gathering the data from the right groups of children to make sure that we're not sort of creating this hyper articulation about learning loss. I do want us to be very cautious about what we're trying to do and what we're trying to say. But we are seeing that, we have a lot of children who may not be coming to programs or even attended virtual lessons. And again, it may not be because children don't want it. It's because they may have access issues with sort of having the electronic gadgets, even access to bandwidth. We're talking about even in urban sectors and rural sectors where we don't have enough access to broadband, right? So that means that those who want to get virtual learning lessons won't be able to have it. So we do have to, I think, begin to really see what are the conditions to ensure that children are learning. And so we can't just put it all on children, all on families for not doing, quote unquote, the best to reduce their learning loss.
Great, thank you. I definitely want to follow up on that last point about different students, but first I'm going to go back a little further to hit on those standardized assessments. You mentioned standardized assessments, and that is certainly a big point of debate in state houses across the country. Through your research and in your opinion, really, with those standard assessments, do you see them being necessary or one part of a piece, or should we move more towards just getting kids in the classroom doing diagnostic assessments? I think there's probably 3 different ways to think about it. Do it the way we've always done, do it in other things, or just do those diagnostic assessments.
Right. Look, I mean, of course, I'm not going to say that we should throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? Like, I do think, right, schools need something that they can measure, you know, whether it's teachers or programming or policies or strategies. So they need something standardized, right? However, what I would encourage states and leaders to do is really to expand the notion of what is learning, what are the outcomes that we're seeking, and also asking whether the assessments we have are they bias free, right? We already know a lot of our assessments are really based on white-centered middle class. Again, not saying that those are negative things, but it does say that means that there are other things that we need to begin to measure for those who may not be white and those who may not be middle class, or those who may not speak English even as their first and only language. And so I think this is probably the time that we can take to say, we can keep some of those assessments, but can we expand the table of what is learning, what is excellence, what is it that children know, and how can we support their learning to prepare them not just for school, but for life, right? So even being able to gather more in terms of social emotional health, right, learning, being able to gather even for children who have always sort of had this sort of live 2 worlds, right? The biculturalism, even the bilinguistic sort of life, being able to gather children's ability to navigate between 2 worlds is a huge cognitive task that we don't really measure, right? Being able to deal with biases and racism, we don't measure that either. And those are huge cognitive load on young people. So I do think we have to begin to think about, are there other metrics that we can add that really gives us a fuller picture of what children bring? And of course we need, and again, a lot of some of these standard assessments don't actually help teachers prepare lessons for children or personalize the children. So to me, we have to think about other kind of assessment tools that can help to guide teachers in ways that they can really support the specific and unique needs of each of their children in their classroom. Right now, standard assessments don't really provide that kind of tool. That's not their role. And so we have to, I think, begin to sort of expand both what is considered learning, what is considered excellent, what is considered doing well or proficient, but also, I think, expand it and also provide tools that teachers and educators and others can also use in terms of the personalizing lessons for children. And of course, I think provide tools that teachers and families can talk between, right? We know that there's a lot, and this, to me, this is an opportunity, right? It's not a horrible thing. We're at a time where families were literally the children's first teacher and only teacher. And so being able to, for schools and families to come together with some sort of level of metric to say, what have you learned about what your child is doing? And begin to gather that kind of formative assessment from families so that we can, and then use that continuously, right? Continue to engage with families about what are you learning? What are you seeing your children be able to do, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we can do a lot more and really take this opportunity to not sort of focus on the learning loss, quote unquote, but to really say, what have you been doing to support your child's development, their learning, their social emotional health, and how do we take that, right, and then move that forward when they return back to schools? And how do we center educators and families together in service of children, especially for children who have literally been in their own space, in their own sort of home environment or community environment. And so I think there's a time for us to think differently about how schools should operate. Should they be the ones directing all the assessments, or should it be one that says schools could have some assessments that is necessary, but also how can we better engage families and even other caregivers to say, here's what children are learning, and can we capture in a way that could really feed teachers about what they can do better in the classroom to support children?
Great, thank you. real quick, Emma, are there examples of assessments like that that exist currently, or will those have to be developed?
So I would say that we do have some assessments really, especially around the social emotional spaces, right? Around things, even things like self-regulation that we do see parents being able to also complete. We have questions around children's attention, children's motivation for learning. Those are things that we already have that both teachers can complete, but also families can complete. We even have the early development indicators, which is used around the world, right? To really gather how are children doing and prepared in terms of formal schooling. So it gathers things around physical development, emotional health, language abilities. And again, because it is used globally, it at least can give us some indicators about where are areas that children are needing support in and where are areas that they're excelling in. And I would say there may not be as many in sort of the area around social emotional health, particularly around issues of bias and racism and coping with racism, but there are emergent sort of measures that we can definitely tap into to kind of accelerate, I should say, those kind of assessments. But again, they exist. I think that schools and institutions that are interested in going just beyond the basic reading and math. I think if we are interested in really ensuring equitable experiences and outcomes, then we know that we can identify tools and also continue to innovate in the tools that matters for all children.
Well, and that is actually a perfect segue into the next question I want to talk to you about. In your position as the director of the Equity Research Action Council, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how students of color have experienced the pandemic differently, being at home, both in positive and negative ways.
Right. Well, thank you for that. Yeah. So part of the reason for the Equity Research Action Coalition is to really be sort of a really aligned research program partnership with policymakers and on the ground. And really the goal is to really recenter research to really come from a strength-based, anti-bias, anti-racist perspective around the research, but also how that research is activated to really meet the needs of Black children and other children of color. And I would say what we know from our data we've gathered is that yes, Black children and their families are dealing with the pandemic in ways unseen, right? But also recognize that Black children, other children of color have always experienced challenging circumstances, whether it's in the community, but also in schools or in education. And so it's just exacerbated even more, but the issues that we see now were already there. But what we have seen, for example, a colleague, Teresa Chappell, did a Facebook sort of survey with her Black mothers, and the mothers were like, 10% were like, may never come back to schools again, because what they realized is that in many ways, schools have been harmful to their children in the ways that they view their children, the ways that they engage with them, the ways that they even provide learning for them, right? The ways that they see them, right? In terms of whether it's suspension, expulsion, or just exclusionary practices. And on top of that, families were really concerned about how their child's race, particularly Black families, were impacting their children's, harsh discipline, their opportunities for life and success, and even the interactions with school resource officers or police officers. So there were already challenges. And I think in many ways, while we've been dealing with COVID-19, families, particularly Black families, have been dealing with COVID-19, with racism and biases, and it's just been exacerbated under these conditions. But I will say that Black families in particular are very hopeful, right? They believe that as we continue to focus on issues of equity, that we could do better, but they understand that this is a time for schools to begin to center their needs, center their voices, their experiences, the fact that many children are going to schools that were under-resourced, that really were not even safe and healthy places before the pandemic. So I think that this may be the time to sort of say, hey, families, how could we work in partnership to create not just a physically safe and healthy space, but a healing space for Black children to not only thrive socially, emotionally, but also thrive academically, right? So this is what I think, Black families are calling for, is a bit more of schools. Please partner with us in the ways that recognize our culture, our experiences, our language, and our history, and the trauma that we continue to experience in many public spaces. And so I do think that this is an opportunity for public policymakers to really lean in on the issue of equity and really address all the historical ills, but also the contemporary ills that are coming based on COVID-19 and other systemic issues.
Great, thank you for that. That is obviously very exciting work. We hope as more of those conversations happen, you'll come back and continue to talk to our constituents about how those conversations are going, how Black families are using their collective power to change the education systems to meet the needs of their students more. So thank you for that. I want to keep us on time. So with that, I want to open it up to any questions from the audience for Emma. And again, you can throw those right in the chat. You can unmute yourself and ask your question if you'd like. There will be also time at the end to ask questions of our entire panel. Well, I am seeing that Benjamin is keeping you well updated with links in the chat, so feel free to look at those. Maybe those are answering a lot of your questions. But with that, I will hand it over to Benjamin to talk to Dr. DePaoli.
Thank you, Patrick, and please, as we're going along, feel free to put questions in the chat at any time, and we will make sure to pose those to our panelists. And thank you, Dr. Iruka, for opening us up with that discussion. We're excited to introduce Jen DePaoli, who is, as Patrick said, a senior researcher at the Learning Policy Institute, and her work focuses leading the deeper learning team on social emotional learning, performance assessments, and assessment and centering the whole child. And that really, I think, is where we want to start our conversation. Dr. DePaoli, your work focuses on educating the whole child. So how can this approach affect our understanding of the pandemic's impact on students?
Yeah, sure. So, and I apologize, my internet's going wonky, so I'm technically on the phone right now. But, you know, I would just echo everything that Dr. Iruka said before me. That was brilliant. I feel like I don't need to say anything more, really. But, you know, we use the term whole child because for so long we've thought of students and young people in this country as kind of these one-dimensional figures that just go to school, they learn, that's where they get their academic knowledge, and we never really thought much more about their overall development. And so we know from the science of learning and development that students are multidimensional, just like every other human being. I'll just say really, really quickly that I was on a briefing last week with some high school students, and one of them was like, treat me like a human being. And I was like, yes, thank you. And you know, what we mean by that is that students are constantly developing academically, cognitively, socially, emotionally. They're developing identities. Their mental health and physical health and well-being is constantly in flux. And you know, we have to be thinking about all these things when we treat students, the way we treat students and the way that we form schools. I think the biggest thing about this pandemic is that it's just shown an even more glaring light about the fact that schools haven't been whole child places. And, you know, that really kind of put a lot of schools in the short term when the pandemic started at a loss because they didn't have those relationships. They weren't thinking about students in this more holistic way. And the places that were, so I'll just throw out, you know, we do a lot of work around community school models, were places where they were thinking about students in a more holistic way and families in a more holistic way. And those models were really effective at taking this crazy pandemic that started and pushed everybody out of the school building, but still being able to connect them really well to the resources that they need, whether that was you know, free meals, whether that was mental health services, whether that was, you know, tutoring or getting counselors involved or whatever the spectrum was, students with disabilities, you know, getting them connected to the right services. So when we think about whole child, we have to think about what are all of the aspects of students' needs. And like I said, I mean, it was an inequitable system before, and you know it was just exacerbated, kind of like what Dr. Iruka said. Like we've just seen an exacerbation of it through the pandemic.
Thank you for that, and I think we'll want to come back to your discussion of the community school model in a little bit. But something you're starting to touch on that I'm wondering if you could expand on, and what I was thinking about last week, I was on the phone with a high school age cousin of mine in New York City. And it seems that the last year has been in some ways a traumatic experience for many of our students. And so I'm wondering if you could touch on what research tells us about the traumatic impacts and the inequitable nature of these impacts of the last year on students.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm just echoing again what Dr. Ruka said. Like, this year has obviously been full of trauma for everyone, whether we realize it or not. But for students, it's been especially hard because, you know, they were in this position where they were going to school every day, whether that was a safe, welcoming environment or not, was a touch point in the day for them to go to. Now, all of a sudden, those kids are at home. Sometimes those homes were safe places. Sometimes they weren't. Either way, they lost those, you know, specific connections with their peers, with their teachers, with other folks. I mean, you know, we think about how isolating it was when we went into lockdown the first time, and that, you know, can obviously affect students. And I think the one thing to really keep in mind too is that, you know, students' brains are constantly, right? Young people's brains are constantly developing and they're changing. And especially, you know, when they're elementary school, middle school, even into high school, the impact of this can have very long-term effects on the way that their brains have developed. And, you know, whether or not that, whatever the level of trauma was, right? And I know we use trauma a lot in this business now, but there are varying levels of it. And, you know, I'll take it back. So my nieces and nephews were at home, right? Like, but they were in a home where the parent, my brother and sister-in-law were there. They could take care of them. They didn't lose their jobs. You know, it was still very stable. But for a lot of families, it wasn't, whether they were dealing with, you know, the health of relatives, whether they were dealing with unemployment, whether they were dealing with, you know, not having the tools to even connect to their schools, right? We talk about the digital divide all the time, not having access. You know, those things have all impacted students in really big ways that we need to be really mindful of. And I'll just throw out, you know, one quick fact. And I know there's been a lot, if anybody's paying attention to the news at all, about the rates of suicide or suicidal ideation that has gone up, the rates of mental health calls. I think, you know, the CDC reported something around a 90% increase in mental health calls for young people. And yeah, it is, you know, and I'll just go back to the inequities. We know that the COVID pandemic has inequitably hit Black communities and Latinx communities. We know that students who are most likely to be virtual throughout this, NCS just put out a study that it was most likely to be Black and other students of color who have been at home this entire time. And we also know they're the ones that were least likely to have high-speed internet and access to the tools that they need to, you know, participate in the school day. So yeah, it has been very inequitable. And I think, you know, as we go back and hopefully we'll have a more normal school year in terms of being in person next year, but we have to recognize that students are going to be bringing those back, and some students are going to be bringing back a lot more than others.
Thank you. And it's nice to see you back on the screen. One last question about the impact, and then I'm hoping we can turn the discussion a little more forward-looking and to some of the ways that we can address these impacts. But you mentioned the long-term impact of trauma on brain development, and I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit, particularly in the realm of social emotional learning. We know that there have been studies about what long-term impacts a loss of academic growth can have on students. What does it mean to have this impact on their social emotional growth as well?
Yeah, so I mean, we know that learning is contextual, right? So what is the context you're learning within? So obviously the change in being from a classroom to being at home and maybe not having all the resources. We also know, you know, I know from all of my close teacher friends that, you know, you've got kids sometimes that are learning when there's 2 or 3 other kids in that same home that are all trying to learn at the same time. So there's a lot of those impacts of just the change in context that is affecting their social and emotional development. We also know that relationships play a major part, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but the loss of relationships is really detrimental to their social emotional well-being. And just the overall disconnection. I mean, we've seen a rise in attendance, chronic absenteeism. Students just aren't even engaged. We know that, a lot of kids depended on expanded learning opportunities, out of school time, after school time, and those went away in a lot of places, or have been, they had their funding cut. They weren't able to provide those same resources. So yeah, I think it's having a major impact. And I just think in general, we all grew up where we went to school, we had our friends, for better or worse. We had our teachers, we had that experience. And I just think, we have to just be so incredibly aware of the fact that, young people have been away from that in so many ways. And it is affecting it. And as you said, looking forward, though, there are a lot of ways we can think about how to make sure we're addressing those issues and making sure that we're getting kids back into a place where their development can get back on track. And I want to go back to, because, Dr. Ruka, you said so well around learning loss. And I just don't believe that there has been learning loss. I think there's been different learning and in different places. And so, we have to consider everything that they have been through this year as a part of now their new developmental trajectory. And how do we now take that to a place that they can build off of it, and we can be supportive of them.
Thank you for that. And there's a term you've been using in a couple of your briefs, which we'll put in the chat, which is a restorative approach, both to reopening schools and to developing equitable education policy and practice moving forward. And so I'm hoping you can give us an overview of what you mean by that, and what does a restorative approach to this next period look like? Yeah,
so we believe that schools should be redesigned to be what you said, as restorative spaces. So those would be environments where young people are known, nurtured, healing is at the center of it, equity is at the center of it. We want them to be places where students' unique strengths, needs, and interests are really valued. They're put at the center. We've heard for so many years, student-centered, student-centered, student-centered. And I don't genuinely think that a lot of those approaches have been actually student-centered. So we need to put students, voices at the heart of it. We also need to be thinking about, how do we bring communities in, right? Schools used to be the center of communities, and they used to be places where, that was it. That was the center of, that's where families went. That's where, communities knew that they were raising their children in so many ways. And, also for better or for worse. But I think we need to go back to that place of, here's what students are telling us they need, and we have to be responsive to that. And I think that's a big part of it, is being responsive, having safe, inclusive environments, valuing consistent, caring relationships. And I think, as you mentioned, we just put out a brief, and a lot of that talks about, in a general sense, but I think when we're looking to the next school year, if we go back to next school year and the first and only thing we care about is getting kids academically back on track, we are missing the larger point. Going back to what you were asking me before about social emotional, learning is inherently social and emotional. We know that you can't do the academic piece if you're not attending to their social and emotional needs. And that has to be the center of a restorative approach. And so, yeah, I think going back to Dr. Ruka, you brought this up about, restorative approaches. A lot of times we hear the term restorative around discipline. And I think there's a lot of concern that if schools don't start taking a restorative approach when they go back, that kids are going to be even further pushed out. Because we know if they come back to school next year, and we've already seen it a little bit this year, and you're not taking care of those social and emotional needs, if you're not understanding the lived experiences they've had, if you're not trying to develop those relationships and building those strong, caring environments that we know can be supportive, kids are going to act out because they have been dealing with this for a very long time. And if we turn immediately to the old way of the, detentions and suspensions, and instead of trying to understand, it's going to have it's going to be even worse than it was. And we already know that the kids who are most likely to be at the receiving end of, harmful discipline are Black and Brown students. And so I think, if we don't take this attitude into this year and think about how we can build restorative spaces, I think we're only going to exacerbate even further than we already have the inequities that we experience, that we've seen in school that research shows us exist.
Thank you, Jen. And those briefs are in the chat, and I would invite anyone at this time, in the interest of time, we're going to move on to our final speaker. But if you have any questions right now for Dr. DePaoli, feel free to put those in the chat or unmute yourself. And I see one. And this is a question perhaps that Yomi, you can speak to as well if you'd like, but we have a question of what sorts of supports could state policymakers prioritize when using the recovery funds that are now available to address these needs that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, some of the things that we think are really important, I mentioned before, like community schools models or any model where integrated systems of supports is prevalent. We know that you can hire community school coordinators and put people like that in schools who can help make those connections outside. We're also talking a lot about making sure that you are investing in social emotional supports. That doesn't mean just investing in like an SEL curriculum, but a lot around professional development. We would love to have a ton of money be spent on counselors and mental health, providers, but we also know that a lot of it has to be done by teachers. And so that's really big. And I will just say one other thing really quickly, and then, just to keep in mind this, and I know I've talked to other people and I know that the NCSL has been messaging this as well, but the money doesn't have to be spent right now. So there are a lot of short-term needs to focus on, and there's a lot that could be invested in this summer. And, there is money set aside for that. And there's money that can be set aside for social emotional supports moving forward. But this money could be used for a lot of really long-term investments. So starting restorative justice programs in schools, setting up those community schools models, investing in long-term high-quality PDs. I know, Dr. Ruka, you mentioned, anti-racist training, and we always talk about culture responsive training. That's not something that a lot of teachers that know, or it comes naturally to them. So think about these things in the long term. How can we invest? And even as early as ed prep programs, how can we make sure that we're focusing on training teachers now for everything that they're gonna need to do? So I would think about it in a lot of different ways depending on your state context, but I think there's a ton that can be done right now to better train and equip teachers and to start building some of these practices out.
And Dr. DePaoli said beautifully a lot of what I would have said, and I would just sort of highlight that, this is an opportunity to really, I think, center restorative practices, but really equity as the center of it, right? To me, for school systems to be better long-term, they're gonna have to do that. And so I'm actually gonna put a report in the chat. And I think certain things that I think some of the money could be used for is really to have a much more robust data system, right? About your workforce, about your children in schools in ways that really begin to say how we move in equity and have the right indicators there. We have a lot of data systems with not even race, ethnicity of teachers, of programs. So there's just a lot of data that we don't even have enough of. I would say, again, is to think about how do we sort of address the issue of workforce preparation, both pre-service, but also in service, especially around issues of racial equity, anti-racism. I think that COVID-19 hit us, but so did racial reckoning, right? We cannot take this moment and go back to normal. Some of us don't want normal. You may not have families coming back because they don't want normal. They have seen it, they have done it, and they're ready to move on. So I would say this is an opportune time for policymakers and those who are going to be distributing funds is to think about it in a more long-term. What is the long-term gain? Yes, do your short-term in terms of making schools safe, but even getting school buildings up to code, right? We have schools in Michigan, North Carolina, across the country that literally kids cannot drink out of the water fountain, right? So even making just buildings physically safe and healthy will be really important in the short term, but then thinking about the long game to keep children and families there and safer. And then, of course, I would say that, continue to sort of lean in on what curricula and or associated assessments around issues of equity and bias, because in the end of it, I think, Dr. DePaoli is right. We have children who are coming into the building who have been living a different kind of way that's probably been more healthy for them in some regards. And we don't want them to enter into schools where they're going to be fully pushed in again in terms of their mental health. And so I think we need to think about a lot of the mental supports and wraparound care. That means coaches, a lot of workforce in that space of social emotional health. But I would say the report has a lot of places that you can begin to build out infrastructure, particularly to dismantle racism in both early care education, but even K-12 writ large.
Thank you both. And I will turn it now in the last section of our meeting here back to Patrick to talk with Megan McCormick from MDRC about this question from Jorge and also her work.
Great, thank you so much. I, for one, am very excited to talk to Megan in this next segment because we're going to have a little bit of a greater focus on those early learners, those preschool to third grade kids who maybe have never been in a classroom because their education career started during the pandemic. So Megan, the first thing I want to talk about, kind of piggybacking on the conversation we just had about how to make investments in this recovery period. But you recently made the case for investing some pandemic relief funds in summer programs for young kids. Can you highlight some of the main reasons why you think this is a good bet for school districts right now?
Yeah, so we have done a lot of work thinking about, at MDRC, thinking about our research, which we are known for kind of doing randomized trials to provide causal evidence for policies and practices that work and have been shown across a variety of settings at scale to have impacts on kids. And so we've tried to take that base of evidence and apply it to what lawmakers have prioritized in the American Rescue Plan. And so schools, as I'm sure everyone in this group knows, and districts should be using up to 20%, at least 20% of their funds from the ARP towards out of school time learning experiences, including summer learning, extended day programs, and extended year programs. But in the bill, interestingly, the money is supposed to address like these key issues of, the quote is from the bill, learning loss, but I would kind of defer to the language that we've discussed this far, really like learning recovery and considering different types of learning outcomes. And what we're concerned about is that because most of the data that we have on like how kids are being affected by the pandemic is for older students, we don't really know as much about how younger kids are being affected by the pandemic because some of these kids have never actually entered the formal school system yet. So if they're pre-K students, they might not be engaged in the formal school system yet. And if they're kindergarten students, we know that kindergarten enrollment is substantially down this year. And so we're really losing a lot of information about how these young children are experiencing the pandemic. To that end, though, we know from some evidence-based work that high quality summer programs in the summer prior to kindergarten or in the summer between kindergarten and first grade can support student learning and also build on the educational experiences that they've had during the academic year. And so our work was kind of building on that evidence base to point out to policymakers that in allocating funds for summer programming, we really should also be including young kids, so pre-K and kindergarten students, in that planning as a way to kind of get them the exposure to these formal learning settings that they're going to be transitioning to, hopefully full-time in person in the fall. And we think it's really, really critical to build on the evidence there. So we know, for example, from randomized trials that academically oriented programs that lack engagement in social emotional learning and are just not very engaging for kids, have a big difficulties actually getting people to show up for them and getting kids to show up in the summer. And so in thinking about designing these programs, our kind of advice would be to build on the evidence and design fun, engaging, interactive programs that kind of get kids excited about learning, expose them to a broad set of learning experiences that help them build problem solving, critical thinking, vocabulary, but also are kind of the types of summer learning that we want all of our kids to be exposed to. And that's going to be something that they want to do and that's going to accomplish multiple goals while kind of helping them make that transition into the formal academic year.
Excellent, thank you. And then I do want to really quickly plug the next meeting in our series tomorrow is going to get even more into the topic of re-engaging young learners or learners in general. So just a plug for that. But next question, Megan, how important is kindergarten during this recovery period? You talked about the missing kindergarten cohort. It's something we've been tracking. And it's a question that we continually get from legislators about the importance of kindergarten. Right now, only 19 states in the District of Columbia require kindergarten. But can you talk about the important role that that early start to the K-12 system could play in our recovery plans?
Absolutely. So right now, we do a lot of work on pre-K, so the 4-year-old year. And then we have a lot of evidence starting in more like the tested grades in elementary school about the curricula and programs that support student learning. But we actually in the field know kind of less about this transition into kindergarten. And so the work that we're doing is kind of looking at a pre-pandemic sample of kids from our early learning network study in Boston, which is connected to the work that Dr. Aruka is doing with folks in Nebraska, has demonstrated for us that there's a really abrupt shift in kids learning across pre-K and kindergarten. So whereas in pre-K, kids are exposed to a lot of child-directed instruction, centers, play-based learning, they kind of abruptly shift in kindergarten and are mixed with a group of kids who have all different learning experiences coming together. And it's also much more whole group, it's much more academically oriented, and it's much more teacher directed. And our work has actually shown that when kindergarten settings look more like pre-K settings and that there is more time for child-directed learning, there's more time for teachers to engage in small group instruction to support kids' individualized and differentiated needs, that can actually be a more supportive context to support longer term gains in kids' outcomes. And we actually think those types of learning experiences are particularly important for kids of color and kids who are coming from lower families with lower incomes. Then the other kind of key piece of this, though, for the pandemic is that this year is going to look even more different, even more varied in terms of kids' skills when they show up to kindergarten. Skills, again, on traditional assessments than it has been in the past, because we're going to see kids having a variety of experiences prior to kindergarten. Some kids will have been in formal pre-K programs. Some kids won't. Some kids will have been at home with their parents since March 2020. This is really the first time that they're in this kind of more formal educational setting. And so to that end, kindergarten this year is kind of more important than it's ever been before, because having the supports in place to recognize the different strengths that kids are bringing to those experiences and building on kind of what they were exposed to in the first 5 years of their life is going to look different this year than it has in the past. And so our kind of recommendations for policymakers is, when thinking about allocating funds to support learning in schools, really prioritizing kindergarten, because we know that kindergarten from quantitative evidence shows that the assessed skills that kids take in kindergarten are highly predictive of longer term outcomes. And so if we can kind of have in place the social emotional supports, the academic supports through different types of curricula, professional development, and quality improvement efforts to ensure that kindergarten year is highly successful, it is going to be a good investment in terms of supporting longer term outcomes, is our guess. Again, all of this pandemic research are things that we're trying to come up with based on pre-pandemic samples and evidence. But our guess is that given that we know kind of those early skills are so important for longer term outcomes, and those early experiences are important for longer term outcomes. Putting investments into those experiences, we think can have longer term benefits.
Great. So I think we all understand that managing kindergarten classrooms is can be chaotic on the best day, but coming back from the pandemic, it sounds like it's going to be even more stressful. Can you talk about early learning providers specifically? You mentioned some of the challenges they may have, but what are some of the things that states can be doing to support these providers as it sounds like the scope of their job has just expanded even more?
So one key recommendation that we've actually heard teachers giving in some of our work is that they would love extra hands in the classroom. So in a lot of places in kindergarten, classrooms don't actually have assistant teachers full time. So there might be a part-time person in the classroom that's funded that kind of switches between classrooms, but it's kind of rare to see a kindergarten classroom with a full-time assistant. And so that obviously is costly and has a cost implication. But if we were able to support kindergarten teachers and early childhood teachers by having more assistant teachers in the classroom, there is actually evidence that access to assistant teachers like that can have impacts on kids' learning. In addition, there's a lot of talk right now about tutoring programs. There's less clarity about what that looks like for young kids. But if we can think about strategies for investing in targeted tutoring that can support small group and differentiated instruction and take some of the onus off of one teacher to support a variety of kids' needs and make sure that every kid is getting that individualized support, that could be an effect. We know from evidence that could be an effective mechanism for supporting learning as well. And yeah, those would kind of be the kind of key two pieces, because one thing we don't want to forget about, with obviously focusing on kids' experiences and the disruption that they've had, is a significant disruption that the ECE workforce and kindergarten to third grade teachers, really all teachers, but talking about young kids, have experienced. So this has been also kind of a huge disruption for them and kind of how they've taught before. They've had to be learning on the ground. It's been very stressful for teachers not knowing kind of what's going on, especially in ECE settings that might have been, they went out of business, staff were furloughed. They are being challenged by a variety of issues related to compensation and job security. So also acknowledging the challenges that teachers have experienced and having supports in place to support them and their social and emotional well-being, it seems like a critical piece as well, because that's going to kind of drive the well-being of kids as well.
Great, thank you. And perfect timing. We are at the last 5 minutes of our session here. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to anyone to ask questions of course, Megan, because we just heard from her, but of any of our panelists. So if you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask it. You're always welcome to throw it in the chat. And it looks like we have one here. Well, actually, someone's just signing off. Well, Rich, thanks for joining us. Appreciate you hearing our conversation. Any other questions? Well, Megan, I had another question that seems like we now have some time for. Throughout your comments, you were talking about, we need to do new research to understand, but also hinting back that a lot of the old research we were doing about what works well in classrooms should still be relevant and brought forward. Can you talk about some of that work and how, some of the things that we were really discussing pre-pandemic need to be kind of brought back to the forefront about what works best in classrooms?
Yeah, totally. There's a lot of pre-pandemic research from specifically education on young kids that indicates in causal studies what can work to support kids' learning and can also work to promote more equitable access to high quality learning experiences. I kind of mentioned two of those things, which is having assistant teachers and having access to tutoring programs, but also having the ability to invest in curricula and professional development that supports the type of child-directed, play-based, small group learning that we know from a variety of studies has impacts on kids' learning and development. So not just their academic skills, but also their social emotional development. And what we've kind of heard of why early childhood programs and kindergarten programs choose not to adopt those types of curriculum and professional development programs is that they are expensive. It's a big investment to switch curricula. It's a big investment to engage, to kind of make this huge shift in what is being offered at the kind of setting or a center level. But this could be with the ARP, a huge opportunity to kind of reflect on what we know from pre-pandemic times. We now have the money to invest in that type of instruction and learning. It's really child-directed. It's very individualized, and it exposes kids not just to basic skill instruction, which is what we see a lot in early childhood settings, but it exposes kids to a broad set of content, background knowledge. It engages them in learning that's exciting. It connects to their real life experience and lived experiences. And there are programs and curricula that are evidence-based that can promote that. It's just that it's been difficult given funding constraints to actually kind of implement them at scale. And so given the infusion of resources, the world has changed in terms of the pandemic, but how kids learn hasn't changed. Like, they're still going to benefit from those types of experiences. And I would also, because Iome is here, I have to put a plug in for, this is a huge equity issue. We know that kids who are in wealthier school districts or have access to private schools have access to highly individualized small group instruction that exposes them to rich content. And the fact that other students who are coming from a broader variety of socioeconomic backgrounds don't have access to that type of instruction creates inequities in our learning experiences that kids have.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we are at time. I want to first off thank our excellent panel for coming. It is always great to get just such passionate experts to talk about these subjects and help engage our legislature. I want to thank Benjamin for facilitating this along with me today, and I want to thank everyone who was able to attend. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us with any follow-up questions. We can help connect you to our experts. There will also be posting these resources that Benjamin's been sharing. And if you are watching the recording, please do not hesitate to reach out. Even if this recording is months old, we are going to be continuing this conversation. We'll be happy to answer your questions. With that, I want to wish everyone a good rest of their day and the rest of their week. Please tune in tomorrow at 1 to 2 Eastern time for our final meeting in this cluster series on re-engaging learners. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks. Bye.